Welcome to MBL Global's Making Better Living series. In these interviews, you'll hear from senior professionals in both the insurance and mental health fields about the importance of early intervention in preventing severe mental health issues and the emerging field of psychological rehabilitation as an integral part of an insurance product offering. We'll discuss the corporate social responsibility, brand, claims and sales issues involved when insurance products are enhanced to rehabilitate people, not just buildings and balance sheets.
Natasha, on behalf of MBL Global, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast today. There's been a huge upheaval in Afghanistan in recent weeks. How do you feel that the troop withdrawal was managed kind of logistically and politically over the last couple of weeks in Afghanistan?
Well, there's been a lot of criticism of how the troops left Afghanistan, particularly of Biden's administration, because even though the U.S. pretty much had to leave, there was a deadline set of May 1st, Biden extended it to September. There wasn't a great level of planning of getting out Afghan citizens who had worked with Western governments and getting them out safely from Afghanistan and getting out other Western troops. Instead, it was almost as if they did things in reverse. They announced they were leaving without really having a very good understanding of how quickly the Taliban was going to be able to take over the country. And the administration even admitted this themselves, that we didn't realize that Kabul would fall so quickly to the Taliban. And this had to do with the fact that the Taliban was able to take over without even having to use violence. They were able to just pay people off in some cases, or just promise that they weren't going to, revenge their working with Western governments. So it was much swifter than we thought, and as a result, many people were left in limbo, and it became a full-blown crisis. It was completely chaotic. We've seen the scenes at the airport of people trying to desperately get on planes to just get out of the country, and so it ended in a much more chaotic fashion than I think the Biden administration had hoped for.
I mean, and do you hold, I've just been looking at the news bulletins in recent days. I've seen two people, both in the US and in the UK. So Lindsey Graham in the States and Tony Blair on sort of this side in Europe, both suggesting that they can see troops back on the ground in the foreseeable future. I mean, do you see that happening?
It's not likely to happen in the Biden administration. Since he was vice president under Obama over a decade ago, he was not in favor of U.S. troops being in Afghanistan. He felt that it was an unwinnable situation, and over $2 trillion had been spent trying to stabilize Afghanistan, and they never were able to really establish stability really outside of Kabul. And bit by bit, the Taliban was able to make gains because the Afghan central government was never considered legitimate. They couldn't really build a government from scratch, which was essential to the whole project, that somehow Afghan citizens would hold allegiance and consider the Afghan government to be legitimate. And that never happened, and it didn't matter how much was spent on it. And the other thing was that the Afghan military was never independent. 80% of its funding came from the U.S., so they couldn't act on their own. They were trained and obviously given all kinds of very sophisticated weapons and air power, but they couldn't survive without a huge presence there, and that's not sustainable. And the other thing is that in the U.S., at least, if you look at public opinion research, it's over 70% of Americans that are in favor of the U.S. leaving Afghanistan. And this time, when it's just so incredibly polarized in American politics, that's really basically means just about everybody is in agreement here that the U.S. can't really achieve much there. Now, of course, Republicans have been quick to criticize the Biden administration for the way this has been handled, and that this didn't look good, and that there were many lives that were lost, especially due to the terrorist attacks that happened towards the end there. But I don't see the Biden administration going back in any meaningful way. There are already bases that the administration can use for, I guess, going through with drone attacks, which they've already done. So they are definitely keeping their eye on the situation, but I don't see them bringing in more troops because Biden himself just is completely against this.
So, I mean, talking about the legitimacy of the government, I see that in the last 24 hours or so, the Taliban have announced their new government structures, which I think was interesting there, which includes several figures which are blacklisted by both the US and the UN. So do you see the current Taliban government gaining legitimacy in any way in the West?
No, I don't, although the West will have to work with the Taliban in some way. If you look back into the late 1990s, there were only two countries that recognized the Taliban when it was in power, and that was Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. The rest of the world refused to recognize the Taliban because of how repressive it was, in particular towards women's rights. And the Taliban hasn't really changed much, even though they've claimed that they've changed. I think you're going to see more governments agreeing to work with it. We already see that China absolutely doesn't care whether or not the Taliban is a horrible repressive regime or whether or not it's democratic. The Chinese are always very astute at trying to find opportunities wherever they are, and will probably try to heavily invest in the country as they have done in Africa. We see that Russia is coming back to try to extend its sphere of influence in Greater Central Asia and has established pretty cordial relations with the Taliban. We see that India is establishing better relations with the Taliban in order to offset Pakistan's involvement, which of course has always been very close with the Taliban, or at least segments of the Pakistani government have been. And we see even Iran, which was the Taliban's enemy for many, many years, was supporting both the Taliban and the Afghan central government, so essentially hedging things. So we can see that many countries in the region understand that it is inevitable that the Taliban was going to take over and that now it is in power and this is basically the government of Afghanistan and you have to work with it. But I don't think we're going to see the full legitimacy of countries recognizing it as maybe the Taliban might hope for. This is critical for them if they want to gain revenues from trade and instead of black market activity. And so I think they're going to really struggle without this type of legitimacy. But unless they make huge changes to their approach to human rights, other Western governments are probably going to approach very delicately how they deal with the Taliban, probably try to work with it in order to deliver badly needed humanitarian aid. But I don't think there's going to be some sort of official recognition.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I want to come back, if we can, later to some of the international aid organisations who I know are under huge strain in Afghanistan right now. But you made a comment, interestingly, about women and women in Afghanistan, and one of the things I noted just from the announcement of the Taliban's new government was that the Ministry for Women's Affairs no longer exists under the new government. I was just wondering, before we talk about sort of the potential impact of what's going on in Afghanistan to the West, what you think those left behind are feeling right now, towards the new government, towards perhaps an enforced lifestyle centered around sort of Taliban ideology, and I'm thinking around women specifically there, and to those that may believe that their friends in the West have kind of deserted them at their hour of need. What do you think the sort of the social feeling of the population of Afghanistan is right now?
Well, for the people of Afghanistan, I think they're feeling very hopeless and helpless and feeling full of despair, because there was a period of actual hopefulness when schools were being built, hospitals were being built, bridges were being built. But every time these bridges and hospitals and schools were built, the Taliban or some other violent non-state organization would bomb them. So there was always this dependence on the U.S., and I think there was, to some extent, the feeling that unless they got their own house in order, they were going to be dependent on Western aid, and that this would run out at a certain time. And so many of them are really, really frightened because the Taliban rules in the most repressive manner. I mean, very few regimes we can say actually rule in such a repressive manner, particularly when it comes to women's rights. And we know that when the Taliban was in charge in the 1990s, it was such a dreadful situation for women, not being able to go to school, having to be completely covered, not being able to really work, how difficult it was just to go outside. They have to have some sort of person accompanying them, how difficult it was just to see a doctor, because there were very few female doctors. Many women were committing suicide. And so I think there's going to be a great feeling of despair, anger, frustration among all Afghan citizens, but particularly among women, where I think this is where the most gains came in, where women who had never had a chance to go to school suddenly were getting opportunities to study at university, to become doctors, engineers, whatever they wanted to achieve. And now they're going from that to literally nothing. And I think this is really heartbreaking for these, in particular for these Afghan women.
Sure. So with the vacuum that's kind of now been created by the West withdrawal, I mean, how likely is it that we think that there would be an increase in sort of jihadi groups operating out of the country? I'm already hearing reports that Al-Qaeda, ISIS are sort of already infiltrating. I know the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are sort of aligned in certain areas. What do you see that sort of landscape looking like over the next year or two?
Well, truthfully, a terror group can set up an operation, set up a cell really anywhere around the world. There is nothing to do that we can do to prevent that. We know that the 9/11 bombers were able to plan a lot of it in Hamburg. But what you're able to do in states that are essentially failed or have pockets of failure, like Pakistan, like Afghanistan, is for groups to basically create almost like an insurgency where they actually have an army. And so it's not just a group of people who are planning an attack, but where they're able to, in these failed spaces, set up a guerrilla group that can undermine the stability of citizens living in Afghanistan. Now, whether or not this poses a huge danger to people in Western countries, I mean, truthfully, the chances of dying in a terror incident in a Western country is still very rare. And the heightened period of terrorism was in 2014, 2015, when the Islamic State was using the Syria-Iraqi area as a base to encourage Western-based adherents to plan these types of attacks. Where the biggest danger lies is for people living in countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nigeria, Somalia. They face the biggest threats to terror incidents. And we can look in Afghanistan, which was one of the worst cases of terror incidents. In 2018, there were almost 10,000 people that died due to terrorist attacks. This went down slightly in 2019, but I think these numbers are going to go way up. And another thing that's just important to mention, prior to the last 2 decades, suicide terrorism was unheard of in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. So these are new tools that have been brought into the region that, have a huge impact on citizens living there because they live in fear that these attacks could happen. They tend to target particularly vulnerable civilians, like those attending schools, those at a hospital, those at places of transport. And so we see that for people living in these areas, there's tremendous trauma that is associated with this huge rise in terror attacks that are taking place. And I can imagine that because of this vacuum, we're going to see more of these insurgent types of groups forming and more terrorist attacks targeting civilians in both Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Sure. I mean, and do you think that a contributory factor to that could be the fact that the NATO forces then say have left kind of considerable assets behind in the country? There's a huge amount seemingly of technology, weaponry that could either be used directly in some of certain jihadi activities, or I guess possibly even reverse engineered back to allow that technology to flow into into states, for example, North Korea, China. So, how do you see that being used?
I think when we're speaking of the weaponry that the U.S. left over, much of it is too sophisticated for people, members of the Taliban, to actually use themselves. It required a great deal of training of the Afghans to get them to the point where they were able to use it. And in fact, the Taliban and terrorist groups have been most effective using non-sophisticated weapons. I mean, simple bombs can wreak havoc, and it's cheap and easy to use, and it's easy to recruit suicide bombers. So I'm less worried about that sophisticated weapon that the U.S. Left being placed in the wrong hands, being used by the North Koreans or other groups, because we found that these groups can be much more effective using tools that cost very little money.
Sure. Okay. And we spoke briefly earlier about some of the international aid agencies. I think it's clear that their role in the country has probably not been greater over the last 20 years, or the need for them to be plugged in. How do you see them being able to operate successfully, given the sort of social and political environment in Afghanistan going forward?
Well, it's an incredibly challenging situation for aid agencies, and I think they've faced such a challenging situation in the case of Yemen as well, which offers a useful comparison, where there's been sort of this conflict that's been going on for over a decade, warring factions basically barring the delivery of badly needed humanitarian aid from the key ports. And that's something that I think is going to affect humanitarian agencies operating in Afghanistan unless they have full cooperation from not only the Taliban, but the other violent groups that are in the country. That's one of the key things these violent groups do, is they act as a spoiler. So when some sort of attempt to deliver humanitarian aid, food, or whatever it is, comes through, the Islamic State Khorasan, for example, could bomb and try to undermine attempts to deliver this. And that's what makes it so incredibly challenging for these groups. There has to be a stalemate of sorts. And when you're dealing with these violent groups that don't really adhere to rules, the rule of law and international norms, you can't get them to agree to a ceasefire, and which is really critical to delivering this type of aid and to ensure that humanitarian aid workers' lives aren't put in jeopardy just by trying to be neutral and deliver these badly needed, food, water, and so forth.
I mean, we've seen demonstrations on the street in Kabul, I think primarily, and also in Herat, I think as well recently, women demonstrating and who have been joined by men joining the demonstrations. Can you see at all any possible likelihood that the Afghans themselves will rise up and perhaps retaliate and create a resistance movement, if that's the right terminology, against the government, or a social environment that pushes back against Taliban ideology in the country?
I mean, I think what is more likely is that Afghanistan is going to face constant instability with people rising up, with protests emerging, with pockets of the country not under Taliban control, with violent groups exercising control over other pockets of the country. And that's what I see for Afghanistan's future, honestly, for the next several decades. I don't imagine that people will be able to rise up and effectively get rid of the Taliban. I think there will probably be splintering of the Taliban at different points, with more moderate factions possibly trying to reform and create a more legitimate government, and more hardline factions trying to be more repressive. But that's the biggest problem with the Taliban taking over. It's the group that has been best able to establish stability in the country's history, but it is also the group that is not legitimate. It's not as if a survey would be taken and Afghan citizens would say, yeah, this is who we really want in power. I mean, they actually want a very decentralized government that is democratically elected. And that would be what the majority of people want. The Taliban just rules through fear and through repression, and it's not some group that enjoys any high levels of popularity. But because they have access to arms and because they've become an even more effective guerrilla group, they've been able to take over the country. The problem is they have no idea how to effectively govern. So I think there's going to be outbreaks of protest and violence facing Afghanistan for several decades to come.
So, Natasha, I recall listening to intelligence from the West that was telling us that Kabul would fall within 90 days. I don't think it was 90 hours, actually, post that statement that Kabul actually fell. Why did that happen so quickly?
The Afghan government itself never established legitimacy. It never was able to provide any kind of services, whether it be cleaning up the trash, providing food, clean water, electricity. It was so incredibly corrupt. In some cases, it was filled with people who just bought their jobs, purchased their jobs. Many of them were warlords. Some people were illiterate. It was a complete free-for-all. And because everything was done by connections, the government never really truly functioned. And the people of Afghanistan never really felt that the government was legitimate. And as such, when they were given the choice between the Taliban, which was inevitably going to take over at some point, and risking their lives for a central government that they had no real allegiance to and never built up an allegiance to, the choice was very simple. And that's why it fell so quickly. And it fell in a much quicker fashion than I think the Americans understood, because that Afghan identity, that national identity that the U.S. was trying to build upon, when you talk about nation building and state building, it was never there, and they were never willing to die for the idea, the concept, and as a result, the Taliban was able to take over in a much quicker fashion than I think the U.S. had anticipated. I think the Biden administration had a complete miscalculation in terms of the resolve of the Afghan military and the Afghan central government. In particular, when it came to the Afghan military, once they knew that the U.S. was leaving, their morale completely plummeted. They didn't feel that they had the support necessary to back them up, and that it was inevitable that the Taliban was going to take over. And we see a similar thought process going through the Afghan central government, where you had Ashraf Ghani fleeing pretty much immediately to a neighboring country because he knew that it was inevitable as well. His life was in danger. And that was because there just wasn't ever an allegiance, a buy-in to the concept of the Afghan central government.
I saw the deputy prime minister. I understand he fled into the Panjshir Valley. I believe he was there with the militants that were holding out against the Taliban. Do you know if he's still in the country? Could actually energize some kind of movement, to back against the Taliban, to mobilize militants against the Taliban?
I mean, I think there will be factions forming that will try to fight against the Taliban as they gain more people willing to do so, as the Taliban rules in a repressive manner, as the Taliban doesn't provide the services that they promise, as the Taliban reneges on what they said they were going to do. There will be a swell of people trying to fight against it, and there will be international support for these groups. And as these conflicts become internationalized, they become really protracted. So we'll see that there'll be, I'm sure, all kinds of covert support, probably from Western countries like the U.S., of anti-Taliban groups. And it'll be a situation, as I mentioned, very similar to Yemen, where we just have this conflict that's very internationalized, with a huge humanitarian crisis going on that seems never ending because there isn't really a central government that everyone can get behind.
Natasha, thank you very much indeed for your time. Your deep insight into the country and the social and political implications of what's been going on has been wonderful to hear. Thank you very much indeed. We look forward to speaking to you again. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Please get in touch with us if you'd like to know more about the services we provide, or leave a review if you have any questions or feedback. See you next time.